Hey guys, in this lecture video, we're going to be discussing inheritable diseases. I want to talk about some disorders and diseases that are genetic, and we're also going to talk about some terms that you may see in your textbook that are used to describe these diseases. And I just kind of wanted to clarify what some of these terms mean, and you will not find necessarily all of these diseases in your textbook, so it's important that you actually watch this video because you might be tested on this for your exam. So we'll get started. All right, so genetic diseases or disorders occur because there's a change that occurs within the genes of a sex cell. So here, a sex cell. So that's going to be egg or sperm. And what's going to happen is there's going to be sometimes the chromosomes are not copied correctly. Sometimes we have too many copies of a certain chromosome, but these chromosomes are going to be housed within the egg or sperm. And that's how they're going to be able to be passed on to the offspring. So it can alter, like I said, it can alter the number of chromosomes. And we can also sometimes alter the structure of the chromosomes. And just to give you an idea, this is my terrible drawing of a chromosome. And then there are genes located on each chromosome at a certain spot. There are genes located there. And so sometimes it's a mutation within the certain gene that codes at this point on the chromosome itself that might be altered, as well as the number of chromosomes. We could have too few or too many. All right, so the first genetic disorder we're going to talk about is sickle cell anemia, and it's termed an autosomal trait. And that means this mutation is not on a sex chromosome. So what are our sex chromosomes? That's going to be your X or Y chromosome. So here, sickle cell anemia is a mutation that is not on a sex chromosome, meaning the X or Y chromosome. So you're going to have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and that's going to total 46 individual chromosomes, but we have 23 pairs. So it's going to be on the other 22 pairs. It could be on one of the other 22 pairs, and that's what autosomal traits mean. They're not on the X or Y chromosome or your 23rd pair. All right, so we have sickle cell anemia here, which is going to be recessive. So we've talked about recessive in other videos before, and so recessive traits, remember, are going to be those that are masked by the dominant allele. So at that gene locus on the chromosome, so at that point on the chromosome right here, we're going to have alleles, and we're going to get one allele from our parent, one allele from the other parent. So one's from mom, one's from dad, and these are our options of alleles, right? And the first one here and the last one here are both carrying a dominant allele. This one has a recessive allele here, and both of these are recessive. So sickle cell anemia is going to be this genotype here, recessive. And the heterozygous genotypes actually are going to be resistant to malaria. So first of all, let's start off by talking about what is sickle cell anemia. Well, if you look in this picture over here, sickle cell anemia occurs due to a faulty hemoglobin. So there's an abnormal hemoglobin, which is the protein that's on the red blood cells. So all of these pink circles that you see here, structures you see here, are red blood cells. And within a red blood cell, we have this protein called hemoglobin. And it's supposed to carry oxygen. That's its function. And this abnormal hemoglobin changes the shape of the cell. So you see how the one I circled here is very oblong and it's misshaped. So you can see there are other ones that look like that as well. Instead of the nice rounded red blood cells like the one the arrow is pointing to there. So you can see how this is like a misshapen, this one here is misshapen, and that's due to that abnormal hemoglobin. And what happens are these cells actually crowd out the healthy cells, and sickle cell anemia is actually really painful. These cells, because they're misshapen, they can actually block blood flow. They can because they block the blood flow, they can actually be quite painful. And a few treatment methods would be a blood transfusion for sickle cell anemia. And then also individuals that have sickle cell anemia usually have a shorter lifespan due to this faulty hemoglobin and these misshapen erythrocytes or red blood cells. So the heterozygous genotype, which remember is one dominant allele and one recessive allele, are going to be resistant to malaria. So that means this individual is not going to have sickle cell anemia, but they're going to be resistant to it. In order to have sickle cell anemia, you have to have the two recessive alleles. So why would being a heterozygote be an undesirable trait? If you're a heterozygote for sickle cell anemia, you're resistant to malaria, which is fantastic, especially if you live in Africa where malaria is present. About 90% of all malaria-related deaths are in Africa. So being a heterozygote might be an undesirable trait because if you are carrying an allele for sickle cell here, if they're recessive, you don't have it because you have one dominant allele, and you meet someone who's also a carrier for sickle cell, and you decide to have a child with them, that's going to give your child a 25% chance of having sickle cell. It'll give them a 50% chance that they will be a carrier of sickle cell and resistant to malaria, right? Because they're the heterozygote. So this is why being a heterozygote could be undesirable if you meet somebody who is also a heterozygote or caring for sickle cell. You would have a 25% chance of your offspring having sickle cell anemia. And unfortunately, it's not something that you would want your child to have because it's very painful. You would need treatments such as blood transfusions. Unfortunately, sickle cell anemia is more prevalent in African Americans, and that's because of where malaria, it's evolutionary. So it's kind of an evolutionary trait, and it's because malaria is most prevalent in Africa. So being heterozygote, having this heterozygote genotype actually makes you resistant to malaria, which is good, especially if you live in Africa. So here, let's talk about Tay-Sachs. So Tay-Sachs is an autosomal disorder. Remember, that means that it's not on a sex chromosome. And it is actually recessive as well. And it causes a change in a gene that produces an enzyme. So this certain gene produces an enzyme that functions to break down lipids. And then what happens is the enzyme doesn't break down the lipid, which causes the lipid to build up in the brain. And the lipid buildup in the brain, unfortunately, results in death in about 2 years. So individuals that are diagnosed with Tay-Sachs usually don't live past the age of 2, and that's because this enzyme that normally breaks down these lipids that are in the brain can't do that because there's a change in the gene that makes that enzyme. So quite sad, actually. Huntington's disease. It is an autosomal, so not on the sex chromosome. This one is actually dominant. So in order to have Huntington's disease, you'd have the dominant allele. And it is a mutated gene that produces a protein that actually causes damage to the brain. And that's due to a codon repeat. The codon is CAG at the end of chromosome number 4. So if you have less than 26 repeats of this CAG at the end of chromosome number 4, you don't have the disease. But if you have 40 plus repeats, then you would. So unfortunately, this mutated gene or these repeats at the end of chromosome number 4 produce this protein that ends up damaging the brain. And you can see here it affects the basal ganglia region, and you can see this is the normal brain here, and this is an individual that has Huntington's disease, and you can see how the tissue here has just been worn away thanks to that protein. This is going to cause, because it affects the brain, it's going to cause issues with personality changes, loss of memory, and also impaired motor skills. Great, so let's talk about X-linked color blindness. So this is going to be what we call a sex-linked disorder, and that's because it is actually going to be carried on the X chromosome. So it's going to be on the sex chromosome, particularly the X chromosome is going to have it. So it's associated with the X chromosome here. And it is going to be recessive. And males cannot, what's interesting about X-linked traits is that males cannot be carriers. So they are going to either have it or they don't. They can't carry, and that's because to be a male, you're going to have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And if you are a female, you're going to have 2 X's. So here, if you're a female, you can have a dominant allele and have the color blindness allele, recessive allele here. Your dominant allele will mask your recessive, and this individual here, this female here, will not have color blindness, but they will be a carrier for it. Over here, a male is either going to be able, they're either going to have it here. So this is a male that has it. This is a male here that does not, right? So they cannot be carriers because they have a Y chromosome. They only have one X, and sex-linked traits are based on the X chromosome. Remember that everyone gets an X, only males get the Ys, females have two X's. And then it's actually more common in males. So if you look over here at this picture, you can see it's more common in males. Sorry, I wanted to go back and touch on that. It's actually more common in males because they can't be carriers, right? So either they're going to have it or they don't. And also, if we were to do a Punnett square here, let's say we have a male that doesn't have it. We have a female that is a carrier. Here, the father doesn't have it, the female is a carrier, and here you can see that you have a 50% chance every time you have a male that they will have color blindness. If you look over here, you can actually see that there's a number here. If you can see the number 7, then you don't have color blindness. If you can't see the number 7, then you might have red-green color blindness. All right, so Down syndrome is due to a non-disjunction when chromosomes do not separate correctly during meiosis. So what happens is we end up with an extra copy of a chromosome. Down syndrome is going to affect the 21st chromosome, so you can see that here, and you can see how there are 3, which is why another name for Down syndrome is trisomy, which means 3 copies of that chromosome. 21, because that's the chromosome number that it affects. It's an autosomal disorder, which means that it is not affecting the sex chromosomes, which you can see in the karyotype over here. It's on the 21st pair, and there's just an extra chromosome here. And it's typically the X. It's typically the egg here that usually carries that extra chromosome. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about is Klinefelter syndrome. So in Klinefelter syndrome, this is a non-disjunction of the X chromosome. So here you can see there is an extra chromosome here for the X chromosome. So you have 2 X's and you also have a Y over here. And this occurs in the mother when her pair of X chromosomes don't separate into 2 different eggs. Instead, they're found inside the same egg, and so we end up with this extra copy. What this is going to cause, Klinefelter causes reproductive issues, and it can also result in smaller than average testes for this individual because they do have 2 X's and a Y. So this would be a male because they do have the Y here.